Why has the gun rights issue been such an important issue to so many, despite the narrative from the Democrats that the gun is responsible for the violence that we see in society today? So it's been a volatile time because of the current administration's most recent attacks on the Second Amendment. We're seeing a lot of push out of the Biden administration towards the democratically controlled House in order to get some laws on the books that will limit access and control firearms even further. So we see a lot of drive, a lot of push by Democrats, a lot of push by the administration, and a echoing and parroting in the media by some of these talking points that we're seeing being repeated over and over again. You know, violence is not the individual's responsibility, it's the item's responsibility, and the only cause that we have for violence is because there's access to a firearm. And we know that's a false narrative. We know that that's just a narrative that's been based off of talking points and repeated over and over again as if it is somehow true. And that by regulating firearms, somehow we're going to see a reduction in violence. It's just, you know, materially going to happen overnight, right? We know that's a lie. We know that's not true. And how do we know that's not true? Well, in 1994, there was some legislation that was passed, and it had a sunset clause, and it sunset in 2004. Now, during that period of time, we didn't see any drastic reduction in any violence whatsoever. Now, Joe Biden will tell you that because of his efforts to pass that legislation and the work that he did, that somehow miraculously there was a reduction in crime and violence and death during that period of time. If you look at the statistics, you know that's a lie. You know that's not true. Well, that law that was that addressed that sunset in 2004. And since then, over the last 15 plus years, we've seen some amazing successes when it comes to gun rights and the expansion of our rights and preservation of our freedom. Now, we've seen things, so in 2004, the regulation that was lifted was the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Act. And what that did is it tried to regulate certain aspects of firearms. Now here I have, for demonstration purposes, I have a CZ Scorpion. Great little gun. It's a pistol caliber carbine, but it does illustrate some of the features that they were trying to regulate. Now, things like pistol grips and magazines, barrel shrouds, you know, nonsense thing, flash hiders, things along those lines, things that they have tried to pick up and pass as individual legislation recently or since the lifting of the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Act was lifted. Now, that was, I think it was colloquially termed the assault weapons ban of 94 to 2004, but for conversation purposes, we'll just talk about the Brady Bill, right? And I know the Brady Bill covered things, other things like wait times and background checks and NICS and that sort of thing. But regardless, for conversation, we'll just move it forward. So over the last 15 plus years, we've seen some amazing successes. And that's what I really want to focus on, is the successes themselves and how we got there, you know, why we have some of these successes that we have, so that we do remember that we are better off today than we were 10 or 15 or even 20 years ago, and how it does pay to stay involved, and it does pay to stay active in this fight, because this is a generational fight. Now, there was a famous quote from Ronald Reagan, and I don't remember when this was, but basically the quote from Reagan was, "Freedom is only one generation away from being lost." And I think we're seeing those efforts right now with the woke conversation and the hyper partisan conversations around race and ethnicity and gender and these kinds of just silly, very unimportant topics in the grand scheme of society, right? But I'll circle back to that. I'll come back to that because I think that's an important aspect of this conversation. Some of the successes that we've seen over the last 15 plus years, Heller versus DC or McDonald versus Chicago, right? That preserve the right of the individual to own a firearm for self-defense, even outside of his home. And that was critical, right? Now, as gun owners, we saw that as a success. Now, as Democrats, what they saw was that there were limits available to be applied to the Second Amendment. Now, I think we understand that there's limits on every right? You can't yell fire in a crowded theater because it'll cause panic, unless there's a fire in the crowded theater, and then you can call fire in a crowded theater, right? Because if the fear is that you're going to cause a stampede is overrun by the fear that you're going to have people die from asphyxiation or from fire, then you do declare a fire in a crowded theater because you want to evacuate those folks out of there as quickly as possible, right? So even though it's limited, it's not limited just based off of the words themselves, it's the intent or the expectation of the words behind them. Anyway, other positive things. We've seen local legislative actions with concealed carry being in almost every state. Now, in some states, it's a little more readily accessible than it is in others. We have constitutional carry in quite a few states now. We still see heavy regulation in states like New York, Illinois, and California. But even those are being challenged in the courts to try to open those up and expand those rights to more citizens. Constitutional carry, I think, is in 26 states now. That's an amazing expansion of your civil rights. Suppressors, suppressors were not very common 10, 15 years ago, and now they're just about everybody has access to a suppressor. Other things that we've seen, open carry, campus carry, more women shooters. These are all successes in the grand scheme of the right to keep and bear arms, the rights that we hold dear, and why we should be proud of the efforts and the work that we've done. Now, why have we seen these successes, right? I think there's a lot of reasons why we see the various reasons for success, but I've boiled it down to just a couple of things that I think really do account for a lot of the reasons why we're seeing some of these successes. We saw the Brady ban. So a lot of people that were around during the 94 to 2004 era that bought into the Democrats' lies that removing access to firearms or making it more difficult or just removing firearms altogether would somehow make society more safe. Well, we know that's a lie. The statistics never bore that out. There was a lot of analysis done on the effectiveness of the assault weapons ban, and none of that had any indication that there was any impact to the number of crimes, the number of murders in the United States whatsoever. So it was a lie. And it was a lie fed to the United States by the Democrats. And people start seeing through that. You tell a lie long enough, people will believe you. And they'll give you a chance to prove that lie. And that's what they did with the assault weapons ban. They gave them a chance to pass a law that regulated and limited access to these firearms, but the statistics didn't support the narrative. And so people started to see through that, and they felt like they were misled, that they were lied to, that they were bamboozled. So people are not believing what's being told anymore. Another group or another section that I think has a reason to support the expansion of gun rights there's more of a worldly view now in a lot of society. So we've been at war. We had Desert Storm, we had Afghanistan, we had Operation Iraqi Freedom. So over the last 3 generations, we've had almost 3.5 million people deployed in support of freedom around the world. And with these troops that have been deployed, going to these hostile areas, something that you can't help but take from that experience is how oppressed people are oppressed. Now, how do you oppress a people? Well, you remove their ability to defend themselves so that the only people that have the ability to enact violence on others is the government. And eventually what happens is the government does enact that violence. They pass a law, they do it democratically, they do it in a way that people can slowly consume that. And then when it comes time to enforce those laws or enforce those controls on the population, they do so with lethal force. And if you fight that effort, you'll be put to death or you'll be put in prison. And then eventually what happens is the tyranny and the totalitarianism begins to expand and grow over time until you have a situation where you have the analogy that, the frog in the boiling pan, you drop him in the boiling pan, he's gonna jump out. But if you slowly cook him in the pan, he's not gonna jump out. Well, that's what we see. And eventually, when you get to the point where the water's boiling and you wanna jump out, but your firearms rights are already gone, it's already too late. So that's why a lot of people who've been around the world, who've served their country in these other areas of the world, have seen how totalitarian regimes will oppress their people, and they understand that the right to keep and bear arms is the right that protects the First Amendment, right? It protects all of the other amendments. So as governments become more powerful and grow in more control, it's the Second Amendment that's the last line of defense for the ability to fight off that tyranny if it becomes too extreme. You know, we've got more access to the internet, right? So the ability to communicate with more groups across the world. We get to see, we have access to more information. We see when violence breaks out, when tanks are going to roll over people in Tiananmen Square. We have access to that real time. When we see the events in Myanmar or see the events that happened in Iraq, we can go back and look up that information and find out, how did these events occur? And so it's not just a talking point in a book that we may or may not ever stumble across. These are events that are occurring real time and become viral, and people can talk about them as they're occurring. So access to the internet, more worldly population, and then there, another piece that you can't help but contribute to the expansion and interest in firearms is the better first-person shooter games. Some of these video games are very lifelike, very realistic, and there's a lot of entertainment value that be had from a firearm. I think your ability with your eye-hand coordination. I think there's an inherent desire to self-improve, and the ability to use a firearm or even archery or knives or those kinds of tools that have made us a civilized society. Mastering these tools is something that I think is inherent in almost every human. So, that was an interest to me a long time ago, and just the ability of these video games has gotten better and better over time. So with that, guys, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. Thumbs up are always appreciated. They help with the algorithm, and we know that YouTube's algorithmic based. Comments are always appreciated. If you have anything that you think I left out, or you think that there's some areas that I didn't address, please throw them in the comments section. Where do you see gun rights going in the future? Do you see a continued expansion of those rights, or do you see government cracking down and trying to control the narrative even further to try to convince people? And what are you doing to try to expand these rights? Throw that in the comments section. I'm interested in what you guys have to say about it. Follow me on my other social media platforms. I'm on MeWe, Parler, Instagram, Bitchute, and on Rumble. I'm trying to get a presence there on Rumble as well. I think that may be the future of video sharing. And until next time, guys, stay safe, stay vigilant, stay active in the fight, and I'll see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.